Moving on to current international affairs. The situation around Ukraine. With Western help, the Kyiv regime continues committing war and terrorist crimes against our country's civilians. During the course of the past week alone, Ukrainian artillery and shelling attacks, largely carried out with drones manufactured in the West or assembled using Western components, resulted in casualties and injuries to more than 400 civilian residents, among whom were 21 children. 46 people died, including 5 children. At least 364 were wounded, 16 of them minors. The highest casualties were in the Belgorod region, the DPR, LPR, and the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Here are examples by region. Krasnodar Krai. On August 24th, the AFU attacked Krasnodar's Prikubansky district. Falling drones hit a children's center, done deliberately by the Kyiv regime. 3 children died. 9 more people, including 6 children, were wounded. Belgorod region. In Dubavoye, on August 22nd, a kamikaze drone struck a scheduled passenger bus, wounding 4 people. Several civilian cars were attacked, causing numerous injuries. The DPR. On August 20th, residential areas in Horlivka were shelled, injuring 7 people. On August 22nd, along the Donetsk, Kharkiv, Amvrosiyivka highway near Kharkivske, a Sukhum Donetsk passenger bus was attacked. The driver died. A child on board was killed as well. Targeted attacks were noted on passenger cars and trucks along regional roads. Furthermore, on the 26th of August, in the middle of broad daylight, 8 civilians suffered injuries as a result of a direct strike carried out by Anglo-French Storm Shadow and Scalp EG missiles in the immediate vicinity of the Donetsk City Mall in the city of Donetsk. The shopping mall was targeted. And among those 8 are 2 children. Rubble clearance is currently underway. I want to recall that on August 24 in Kyiv, the new British Prime Minister gave Zelensky these exact missiles. He handed over blueprints to localize their production in Ukraine for these very missiles. And just 2 days later, these exact missiles were used against civilians. Do ordinary Britons know about this? Of course not, because the British media do not tell Britons about it. We will discuss this in more detail a bit later today. Kursk region. Multiple drone attacks struck private homes and passenger cars. Besides drone strikes, targeted munitions drops onto pensioners' homes were recorded on August 20th and 21st. Sevastopol. On the 22nd of August, falling debris and fragments from an unmanned aerial vehicle struck a regularly scheduled passenger bus near the 5th kilometer mark, and that drone had been heavily packed with lethal shrapnel. 2 people were killed, 10 passengers injured, and 4 sent to intensive care in critical condition. In the LPR, massive strikes on the civilian sector on August 22 killed at least 2, including a teenager, and wounded 9. On August 26, 9 people were killed and 5 injured in a strike on Zolote and Pervomaisk. In the Zaporizhia region, 2 people were wounded in an attack on Enerhodar. Overall, since April, Ukrainian shelling of Enerhodar and the Zaporizhia NPP site has killed 9 plant workers, injuring dozens of civilian specialists. By attacking Enerhodar, the Kyiv regime is deliberately engaging in nuclear blackmail, endangering the safety of all of Europe, and essentially the whole world. The tragic consequences of Ukrainian shelling, which injured civilians and destroyed civil infrastructure, were recorded in Adygea, Stavropol Krai, and the Bryansk, Voronezh, Rostov, and Samara regions. Casualty reports are still being updated across all regions. They are paying for all this on the battlefield and through our law enforcement, who continue gathering evidence to prosecute Kyiv regime officials, AFU militants, commanders, and foreign mercenaries. Specifically, on August 21st, a British national named James Akonor was sentenced in absentia to serve 29 years of imprisonment for taking part in hostilities within the Kursk region and committing the murder of a Russian citizen in the Donetsk People's Republic. Regarding events in Kursk region, Russia's investigative committee charged 35 foreign mercenaries in person and in absentia who took part in the August 2024 and April 2025 invasions. These include citizens of Georgia, the US, New Zealand, Lithuania, the UK, and other countries. Investigations against 28 individuals are complete. 7 criminal cases are still pending. Turning our attention now to those who serve as the media mouthpieces for this Kyiv and Western-backed terror campaign, the Western journalists themselves. At the last briefing, we discussed the act, no less extremist than the terror attacks, by the German journalist from Frankfurt. Allgemeine Zeitung, Michael Martens. As a reminder of the circumstances, during a press conference held in Belgrade back on August the 8th, he openly spoke about what he referred to as, quote, assisting in killing Russians. Because the German journalist faces criminal charges under Article 282, Part 2 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation for the incitement of hatred or enmity, he was officially placed on an international wanted list, while Moscow's Basmanny District Court formally ordered that Martins be remanded into custody in absentia. So, who is sponsoring all of this? On August 24th, a gathering of the so-called Coalition of the Willing was held in Kiev. It marked another anniversary of Ukraine's so-called independence, or rather, its loss. It clearly revealed what is truly taking place behind the scenes, exposing precisely who, while pretending to be genuine Democrats and defenders of human rights, is in reality financing, encouraging, and sponsoring extremism and international terrorism. Out of all foreign leaders, the newly appointed British Prime Minister was the sole figure who actually dared to make the journey and show up in Kyiv in person. Everyone else attended via video conference. French President Macron and German Chancellor Merz joined via video link. The gathering's main takeaway was admitting plans to effectively partition and occupy Ukrainian territory. You did indeed hear that correctly. Even as they continue to openly claim their goal is to inflict a strategic defeat on the Russian Federation, they are in fact actively preparing to partition Ukrainian territory. In its official joint communiqué, this self-styled Coalition of the Willing announced explicit plans for multinational military forces to be deployed directly onto Ukrainian soil under the pretext of ceasefire monitoring, while also scheduling dedicated occupation contingent exercises across neighboring EU border states throughout this coming October and November. This effectively marks an initial step toward deeper European and NATO involvement in a conflict they verbally claim to want settled, demanding a seat at the table. As repeatedly stressed, any foreign troops in Ukraine obstructing the special military operation and a lasting settlement are completely unacceptable and will be legitimate military targets. Responsibility will fall on the Western politicians who chose further escalation. Certain parts of the coalition's communiqué simply baffled many observers. It praised, quote, Zelensky's readiness for negotiations. This comes despite Zelensky's own decree, number 679 of September 30th, 2022, banning any talks with Russia's leadership. As we say, whatever he was preparing for, he is ready. Utter cynicism marked the communiqué's mention of cultural heritage sites, specifically the Kyiv-Pechursk Lavra. This looks utterly wild amid Kyiv's anti-Christian actions, drafting laws to forcibly seize churches. from the lawful community by stripping their permanent use rights. Right on the coalition's meeting day, shocking details emerged about a bloody massacre at the Svyatogorsk Holy Dormition Lavra. You remember, right? Radicals brutally murdered monk Arseny and wounded 2 novices there. At the same time, the AFU shelled the Epiphany Cathedral in Holivka, DPR. Yet, the Coalition of the Willing omitted these facts from their communiqué. Why? Whereas in the past, they were able to argue that they completely disregarded both humanitarian issues and religious matters, they have now made a deliberate point of drawing specific attention to them. Please do. Look at the real facts. During the AFU shelling of the Epiphany Cathedral in Holivka, 4 people were injured. 2 of them, by the way, are clergy. None of the allegedly humane participants in this so-called coalition uttered a single word about these crimes, neither in writing in the communiqué nor orally during reports on what they were generally discussing at that meeting. Fresh financial handouts were officially promised to Kyiv in an effort to prop up the crumbling regime, maintain its domestic defense industry, and sustain its armed units. In the face of virtually zero air defense effectiveness and shifting rhetoric from the United States president regarding supplies of Patriot missiles, the British and French tandem announced an acceleration of the joint Freya program. Nevertheless, none of these measures can truly offset the enormous budget deficit confronting the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which is now approaching the $27 billion mark. Zelensky was forced to admit insolvency, stating that the war, a direct quote from his statement, has grown more expensive, making fundraising the main challenge for the regime's survival. As for what is truly primary, we will discuss that when we touch upon Ukrainian mobilization. The culmination of the Western politicians' visit to Kyiv was an overtly blasphemous act by European leaders, led once again by the British Prime Minister and the head of the European Union, Antonio Costa. They were taken, Lord, if only their own ancestors who fought against Nazism could see this now, directly to a military memorial cemetery. There, the British Prime Minister, alongside the President of the European Council, bowed their heads in solemn tribute to honor the direct heirs of Nazi collaborators. In doing so, the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime openly joined in honoring them, aligning themselves directly with this ongoing policy of actively rewriting history, rehabilitating and legalizing Nazism, glorifying wartime criminals, and systematically erasing genuine historical memory. It is particularly noteworthy that high-ranking United States officials completely disregarded and chose not to attend these events in Kyiv. At the same time, Zelensky's latest calculated attempt to draw the American leadership directly into a highly perilous escalation backfired into a very public and embarrassing exposure. This occurred after claims were made regarding SpaceX's supposed willingness to authorize the operational use of Starlink for deep-range strikes into sovereign Russian territory, forcing him to openly concede that Ukraine's Ministry of Defense had simply supplied him with completely unverified and inaccurate data. You know, perhaps we should expand this list. Let's ask Zelensky, did his defense ministry, or NATO, or the SBU provide him with unverified data about Bucha too? Yet, like a broken record, he keeps talking about dozens and hundreds of victims who simply weren't there. None of this is surprising, given the sheer volume of lies the Kiev regime broadcasts to the world daily. Now Zelensky has stepped on his own rake, and Trump, I believe, had a chance to draw the appropriate conclusions. And of course, I want to specifically address the destructive role of the leaders of France, Germany, and Britain, literally fueling and stoking the Ukrainian crisis even further. I want to highlight the destructive role of the European Troika, the leaders of France, Britain, and Germany, in fueling this crisis. Germany is once again harboring open ambitions of creating, in the exact words of German officials and members of its government, the most powerful army across Europe, while at the very same time, Britain is announcing deliberate steps to transfer military technology directly to Zelensky. In Kyiv, Andy Burnham stressed the continuity of London's anti-Russian course and confirmed that Britain not only supplied long-range strike weapons, but also provided Kyiv with tech data to assemble Scalp and Storm Shadow cruise missiles at Ukrainian plants, where, let's be honest, labor is cheaper than in Europe.
Где, давайте честно скажем, рабочая сила подешевле, чем в Европе.
As promised, we will dwell on this topic in more detail later. Incidentally, French President Macron previously announced a similar tech transfer, though he didn't manage to implement it. We certainly track all these moves meticulously. We noted a report in Le Figaro quoting a source at the French conglomerate, Safran, noting that for over a year, this company has equipped the Ukrainian-British Flamingo cruise missile with guidance systems and supplied navigation gear and other systems to facilitate strikes on Russia. Clearly, by handing over so-called assembly capacities to Ukrainians, London and Paris desperately seek to dodge blame for strikes deep inside Russia. It won't work. You in Paris, London, Berlin, and other capitals bear direct responsibility for aiding terrorist attacks. However, I reiterate, everyone must realize, not just decision makers, but those executing their orders in the West, that this is playing with fire, and the fallout could be utterly unpredictable, including for themselves. While the British Prime Minister spouts rhetoric about backing Zelensky for as long as it takes, direct quote, the London press predicts a fatal end for the current Ukrainian leadership. Look here. The Sunday Times describes this year as, quote, the hardest yet for Zelensky. The publication explicitly points to widespread corruption scandals and a severe breakdown in political unity. Indeed, we have pointed out on numerous occasions that the domestic political landscape inside Ukraine has long since transformed into a harsh, authoritarian dictatorship in which the complete suppression and dismantling of the constitutional rights of its citizens is blamed on hostilities, but actually stems from the leadership's fear of the Ukrainian people's inevitable wrath. Recently, Zelensky admitted he fears, his exact words, democratic procedures. He specifically went on to claim that organizing and holding elections right now would, in his own words, be a tsunami for the state that would divide Ukraine. So he's starting to realize that he and his servants of the people, actually Zelensky's servants, are fiercely hated by those very Ukrainian people. No, it's not blind hatred. It's pure rage at being deceived. Essentially, the Kyiv regime violated the entire Ukrainian nation and is now cynically butchering them. Earlier, Mikhailo Podolyak, advisor to the so-called President's Office, flatly ruled out holding an election campaign in an interview with Italy's La Repubblica. What did he cite? He cited, direct quote, an inability to guarantee security. Well, I don't know. That sounds odd, given their claims of having the strongest army in Europe. It certainly seems rather strange that a wide variety of foreign dignitaries and international guests continue to visit the country with their personal safety and protection fully assured, and that Western leaders continually reiterate their complete readiness to provide comprehensive security guarantees throughout the territory of Ukraine. Yet organizing and conducting democratic elections there is somehow deemed far too dangerous. The reason is obvious. The outcome is all too predictable. Instead of letting Ukrainians vote, the Kyiv regime and its henchmen are intensifying mobilization. What is happening there is truly monstrous. As a matter of fact, dragging out and continuing this armed conflict remains the absolute only possible way for the Zelensky regime to hold on to power and ensure its very own physical survival. Now let us take a closer, more detailed look at this Ukrainian mobilization. I do not even know if you can call it bestial cruelty, because frankly, not even wild beasts show such hatred toward their own kind.
Такой уровень ненависти к тем, кого принято называть сородичами.
Choose your own epithet. The cruelty, dehumanization, and madness of Ukraine's forced conscription bodies, the so-called TCCs,
принудительной мобилизации на Украине, так называемых ТЦК,
have gone beyond all limits. In Odessa, their squads have begun using methods borrowed directly from the Nazis during the Great Patriotic War. Recently published footage shows Ukrainian recruiters spraying tear gas into cars where Odessa residents locked themselves to escape unlawful conscription.
В собственных автомобилях с целью избежать незаконной украинской мобилизации. Украинские военкомы начали пускать в салон машины слезоточивый газ.
Turning them into actual gas chambers right on the streets of Odessa. I am certainly not appealing to the conscience of the ruling regime in Kyiv, as it clearly possesses none whatsoever, yet one would hope that at least some lingering glimmer of basic reason and sanity must surely still remain. Somewhere in Ukraine, among those who can influence these decisions. Another symbol of this brutality was the tragedy in Lviv, where a man's body was found near a TCC office in the Sikiv district after he fell ill during detention. Arriving medics failed to revive him, and his wife suffered a severe seizure. The violent actions of these actual TCC punishers are sparking fierce, bitter resistance from the population. On August 21st in Lviv, a local man resisted TCC officers during a forced document check. He dealt the Ukrainian enlistment officer a fatal stab wound to the neck. The attacker was detained by police using firearms, while the draft officer died on the spot from the wound. Well, this is probably what Gogol wrote about in his immortal work, Taras Bulba. It is precisely for this reason that the authorities in Kyiv harbor such intense hatred toward Gogol, consistently attempting to strip the author of his native Russian language. This is the tragedy of fratricidal combat unfolding before our eyes in Ukraine. It is ultimately no longer simply a matter of battling some external foreign adversary, but rather about the harsh reality of how they began the process of completely exterminating one another so very long ago. In Vinnytsia, a group of locals armed with shovels and brooms fought off a recruitment patrol to rescue a resident. You know, honestly, after such news, one cannot help but recall the statement made by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Kuleba, back in 2024. These exact quotes are still readily available online, when he predicted that, when Ukrainians run out of weapons, they will fight with shovels. It has turned out precisely as he said, except that back then, perhaps quite deliberately, he did not specify who Ukrainian citizens would actually be fighting with those shovels. On the evening of August 25th in Ternopil, a crowd of youths protested against forced mobilization in Ukraine, attacking a draft office patrol car. As a result, these Ukrainian recruiters were injured, and arriving police barely managed to evacuate one of them. Following those turbulent events, a crowd of deeply outraged young men and women who clearly grasped the reality of what is currently unfolding across Ukraine and carefully analyzed the official statements regarding plans to lower the military draft age, staged a protest march straight through the central streets of the city. Against the backdrop of truly catastrophic losses and severe personnel shortages within the AFU, Officials of the Kyiv regime have actively rolled out an extensive public information campaign designed to prepare Ukrainian society for the eventual mobilization of women. We have spoken about this a lot, pointing out that this is exactly what they are moving toward. Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov joined this campaign. He put forward a particularly radical proposal, calling for the nationwide mobilization of Ukraine's entire adult population, explicitly extending this requirement to include women as well. Well, considering everything that the gender-conscious Kyiv regime has embraced and adopted from the West, it is difficult to say for certain precisely who Reznikov was referring to when speaking about the fairer sex. Returning to his quotes, he calculates this will double Ukraine's mobilization pool. Reznikov suggests sending Ukrainian women en masse to rear positions and moving men to the front line. And you know, it is always particularly illuminating and interesting to take a much closer look at what is actually happening behind the scenes within the Kyiv regime itself. Yet, Reznikov's two daughters, for reasons probably unknown even to Reznikov himself, were in no rush to head to the front. Instead, they occupy their time with various creative projects, receive colossal sums of money directly from the Ukrainian state budget to finance these ventures, and continue living in this manner. It is always like this. Look where all these relatives, children, and inner circle members of Zelensky are located. Recall how officials of the Zelensky regime, the Kyiv regime, laughed in people's faces, refusing to answer what their own plans were for taking part in the so-called defense and military efforts of Ukraine, while at the very same time openly and publicly admitting that they had just recently sent their own family members and loved ones abroad. The Verkhovna Rada continues working on lowering the mobilization age for young Ukrainian men. The tragedy of the situation is confirmed by Verkhovna Rada deputy Alexander Koltunovich. He stated, I repeat, this is not Russia's president. This is a Ukrainian member of parliament. He stated that in current conditions, the Ukrainian parliament can do nothing except, and I quote, help Ukrainians burn in the fire more comfortably. End quote. Nevertheless, the enduring presence of Russian culture prevents them from feeling entirely like fully fledged ghouls, which is precisely why they persist in fighting against it so relentlessly, determined to eradicate every single obstacle that stands in the way of realizing their truly monstrous and completely inhuman agenda. To distract from real problems or simply following their dark hearts. Zelensky resorted to the tried and tested tactic of attacking Russian culture. He imposed so-called sanctions, which I think made headlines worldwide, against the creators of Masha and the Bear, an animated series extremely popular among Ukrainians themselves. Apparently, things will look up for Zelensky at the front now that he has banned the cartoon in Ukraine and ordered all its social media accounts blocked. This is evidently the very kind of celebrated peremoha, or decisive victory, that is designed to firmly re-establish his presidential legitimacy while putting the full concentration of his sweeping political power on open display for all to see. Meanwhile, Western governments are diligently tallying up the overall financial costs and are only now beginning to fully recognize the heavy burden that the regime in Kyiv has actually imposed upon them in connection with these so-called Ukrainian migrants. Across the board, the extensive Western support programs that were initially established for those individuals who fled Ukraine while posing as genuine refugees and suffering victims are now being systematically dismantled and wound down with what many view as blatant, outrageous cynicism. They are phasing them out and gently nudging this whole matter toward Ukrainian mobilization. For instance, European Commission representative Markus Lammert confirmed the restrictions. According to him, whenever Ukrainian citizens, both men and women alike, seek to obtain or extend their temporary protection status within the European Union, they are now formally required to provide proof that they are not evading military service in the armed forces of Ukraine. Recently, Switzerland joined the EU's harsh measures, restricting migration status for individuals with unresolved military registration issues in Ukraine. How about that? The entire situation regarding human rights across Western Europe truly turns out to be quite a remarkable story. Furthermore, official spokespersons representing the European Commission have now explicitly and formally clarified, in direct response to inquiries submitted by members of the press, that the executive body categorically and unequivocally refuses to entertain any kind of favorable decision or positive resolution regarding the urgent and pressing appeals coming from authorities in Kiev for additional emergency financial assistance. Let me remind you, Zelensky begged for 200 to 220 million euros to subsidize loan interest for small and medium farmers facing bankruptcy. Well, Markus Lammert cynically stated there would be no extra funding and suggested Kyiv survive through its own internal mechanisms. And what mechanisms does Kyiv have? Forced Ukrainian mobilization. If a Ukrainian farmer is unhappy about uncompensated losses, and we all see those losses, they will simply tell him directly, please go ahead and step right inside the military recruitment officer's bus, where they will most certainly find a way to resolve all of your problems. I think these are the mechanisms. They, the EU, the European Commission, Westerners, are only willing to provide funds for war, to send Ukrainians to slaughter. No, not for their own interests or farms, but for Western interests. Under the guise of an Independence Day gift, EC head Ursula von der Leyen approved 6.1 billion euros to buy weapons for the AFU. Why couldn't at least a portion of those funds be redirected to support struggling Ukrainian farmers instead? After all, look at the situation. Zelensky himself was pleading for merely 220 million euros in assistance. From the European Commission, the EU, and Ursula von der Leyen approved how much? Not 3, but 30 times more. She allocated 6 billion euros. You'd think with 30 times what Zelensky asked for farmers, you could spare a tiny fraction, 1/30th, for Ukrainian farmers' needs. No, the European Commission, Brussels, and the entire West ignore peaceful citizens' needs. There is only the need for slaughter, and they always have money for that.
Мирных жителей для Европейской комиссии, Брюсселя и вообще в целом Запада. И только нужны бойни. Вот на это у них денег всегда хватает.
Furthermore, it should be noted that the regime in Kiev will not actually receive this sum of 6 billion euros directly either. Instead, the money is routed straight to European defense enterprises, whereas Ukraine itself is only provided with military armaments bound to tightly monitored and verified agreements. Well, that's the claim, that contracts will be strictly audited. But we know how they audit contracts given Ukraine's infernal corruption. That's the debt bondage disguised as an Independence Day gift. It would be laughable if it weren't so tragic.
Незалежности, ну это очень смешно, если бы не было так грустно.
Incidentally, European arms production fails to keep pace not only with the Zelensky regime's growing appetite, but also with its own planned targets and pledges. As is widely recognized by now, the so-called Czech artillery shell initiative has long since completely failed. Furthermore, the operational launch of a Ukrainian solid rocket fuel manufacturing plant situated in Denmark, designed specifically for those very same flamingos, has now been officially postponed until late 2027, despite having been originally scheduled to be up and running by late 2026. And the cost of this project, believe it or not, tripled to 150 million due to construction delays and management chaos. Now to the Black Sea region, which in 2022 was declared a floating breadbasket through which, as Zelensky and Brussels and other Western capitals proclaimed,
региону по Черному морю должно, как говорил Зеленский, как кричали в Брюсселе, в других западных столицах,
grain and food were supposed to flow so the world wouldn't suffer food insecurity.
от, так сказать, проблем с продовольственной безопасностью.
What has happened and what do we see now, 4 years after that global hysteria?
Тогда всемирных стенаний.
Zelensky's regime continues to pose a military threat to Black Sea littoral states. On August 20th, a Ukrainian uncrewed surface vessel entered the exclusive economic zone, not Russia's, but Romania's, near the Neptune Deep gas platform, 80 nautical miles east of Constanța. Right where, remember, objects previously landed unexpectedly for Romanian citizens. Romania scrambled 2 F-16 fighters to intercept the target. One of them located the Ukrainian Sea drone and destroyed it with onboard cannon fire. I repeat, this is not the first time Romanians have faced dangerous unmanned objects from Ukraine on their territory, land or sea. For instance, between August 18th and 22nd, several vessels operated by Turkish companies were attacked in the Black Sea. An attempt by the ship Ural to aid the crew ended in tragedy for a Turkish crew member, İlker Lazoglu. Another 8 crew members were injured. We see how weapons bought and delivered to the Kiev regime via NATO channels backfire on alliance members themselves. I think this is serious food for thought on where mindlessly pumping weapons into the Kiev regime leads. In this year alone, the AFU struck 214 civilian ships flying various flags in the Black Sea. What was that they said about food security? Back in 2022, a cynical lie. Everything that can be sold, stolen or looted is fair game on Bankova Street. And, of course, regarding the Kiev regime's Nazism, while Ukraine's economy collapses and people die at the front, the Kiev regime keeps showing its Nazi core, which has taken on truly perverted forms given Zelensky's own ethnic origin. Late August marked a sinister 85th anniversary, the Nazis' mass murder of children in Bilet Cerkve. The Nazis shot the adult Jewish population, leaving 90 children alive, from infants up to 7 years old. Even German Waffen-SS Punishers refused to execute the infants, despite having blood on their hands and stopping at nothing. Yet auxiliary police from among Ukrainian nationalists volunteered to do it, to murder 90 young children. Today, the ideologues and followers of these atrocities are buried in military memorial cemeteries in Ukraine, and European leaders are invited there to lay flowers. Zelensky has repeatedly stated, "I am ethnically Jewish," yet right now he leads this process of laying flowers at monuments to Nazis, collaborators and punishers. It's not just betraying what his grandfather, Red Army soldier Semyon Ivanovich Zelensky, fought for. It's how he tries to reformat the minds of Ukrainians who lack the means or capital to leave Ukraine, this modern sanctuary of Nazism. I repeat, he tries to force the entire Ukrainian people to swear allegiance to that very Nazism, and to those wartime Nazis. According to Zelensky's own past statements, widely cited by Israeli media, his great-grandfather and 3 of his brothers were killed by those very Hitlerites during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine.
По ранним утверждениям самого Зеленского, который активно цитирует израильская пресса, его прадед и 3 братьев этого прадеда погибли от рук как раз тех самых гитлеровцев в период нацистской оккупации Украины.
A symbolic proof of the Kiev regime's nature was Zelensky's decree awarding the title of Hero of Ukraine, no less,
Героя Украины, никак иначе.
to Andriy Beletsky, an outright racist and founder of the terrorist nationalist Azov battalion.
Батальона Азов.
What is on the record of this quote-unquote hero of Ukraine? Leading the far-right Social National Assembly, membership in the extremist right sector, and now commanding the 3rd Army Corps built on that very extremist Azov base.
Созданный как раз-таки на базе этого самого экстремистского Азова.
Fighters of this corps gained sinister notoriety not just for using Nazi symbols, but for involvement in the most monstrous atrocities against civilians.
Они причастны к самым чудовищным зверствам против мирного населения.
Former Ukrainian President Yushchenko added to this picture. He told the media he was the first to order shooting at Russian soldiers back in 2003 under Kuchma. Fancy that.
Стрелять по российским солдатам. О как!
One wants to thank Kuchma for writing that book.
Такую книгу написал.
Ukraine is not Russia, that's for sure. After all, in 2010, Kuchma wore the St. George's ribbon on camera and stated, direct quote, "I, Kuchma said, will never agree when my father died fighting Nazism and Hitler's Germany that Bandera or Shukevich should hold the Hero of Ukraine title. It is simply inhuman," Kuchma said in 2010, especially since whoever does this knows full well what wedge they are driving. One cannot agree to this.
Этим он вбивает клин опять между людьми, между народами. С этим, сказал Кучма, не только нельзя согласиться.
We must ensure this never happens again, so nobody is tempted to build a political career on it.
Свою политическую карьеру.
End quote. Kuchma said this back in 2010. Well, is Kuchma silent in 2026? Or will he also lay flowers at the pits where the remains of those executioners and collaborators were moved?
Ямам, в которые перенесли останки этих самых карателей и коллаборационистов.
Today, Kuchma not only approves Zelensky's rewriting of history, but in solidarity with his glorification of the OUN-UPA, he returns the Order of the White Eagle to Poland and literally boasts of ordering fire on Russians.
Буквально кичится, что лично отдавал приказы стрелять в русских.
All these facts confirm the relevance of Ukraine's denazification and demilitarization and eliminating threats from its territory. And these goals, as Russian leadership stated, will be achieved. And now, as promised, more on Britain sharing data with the Kyiv regime to produce Scalp, aka Storm Shadow missiles. There were many questions and much reporting on these actions. I commented briefly. Let us look closer at this topic.
Давайте посмотрим чуть ближе на эту тему.
The Storm Shadow saga is the quintessential story of London's involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. The decision to supply these missiles to the Kyiv regime was made by the British in 2023. They were then amid preparations for the later failed counteroffensive. Even many British politicians considered this decision extraordinary. The UK government understood its danger and illegitimacy, trying to convince MPs, citizens, and even us that it acted, quote, responsibly. British leaders officially claimed these systems would be used, again, quote, only on internationally recognized Ukrainian territory.
Что данная система будет использоваться, опять же, прямая цитата британских руководителей, только на международно признанной территории Украины.
That stance was recorded in a relevant note from the British Embassy in Moscow. Clearly, the British then tried to show that London. Later, Britain dodged all questions about the actual use of Storm Shadow missiles, but eventually their deployment became obvious.
Всячески уходила от ответа на вопросы о реальном применении ракет Storm Shadow, но в какой-то момент их использование просто стало очевидным.
Later, such strikes went beyond London's declared, albeit fictitious, claims, an area impossible without direct foreign specialist involvement in operating and targeting data for the AFU.
Этой системы вооружения, а также без предоставления отдельными странами НАТО необходимых разведданных для ВСУ.
In May 2024, then Foreign Secretary David Cameron told Reuters, direct quote, Cameron stated Ukraine had the right, as the Briton put it, to strike Russian territory with British weapons. Direct quote continuing, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine. I simply want to use, not even translate, but read the direct quote in English to prove once more that he said it.
Даже не переведу, а использую прямую цитату непосредственно на английском языке, чтобы еще раз убедить всех в том, что это было им сказано.
Ukraine has that right, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine. That is the direct quote. This hostile remark directly contradicted earlier British assurances that Storm Shadow missiles would under no circumstances target Russian territory, knowingly disavowing that principle and making London a de facto party to the conflict.
Сознательно дезавуировал этот принцип, признав де-факто свою страну стороной конфликта.
Now we hear London is ready to give Kyiv data needed for independent Storm Shadow production. The government surely understands the consequences and how Kyiv would use Storm Shadow if acquired, which won't be allowed, yet London cannot shift blame onto Kyiv's puppets.
Активно восполнять арсенал, чего наши военные, естественно, не позволят. Но переложить ответственность на киевских марионеток Лондону не получится.
Telling are the attempts by London politicians to ease their own public's concerns over these reckless moves.
Собственного британского населения.
Look at the local press. Ridiculously, they started calling this very missile Scalp in English.
Стали именовать ракету «Скальп»
instead of Storm Shadow, literally trying to cover tracks and blame the French, while praising the provocative step alongside claims it supposedly escalates nothing.
Соседствует с пояснением, что ничего усугубляющего ситуацию в нем якобы нет.
Recent events leave no doubt that all UK government actions serve one single long-term goal, inflicting, as they put it, a strategic defeat on our country.
Нанесению нашей стране, как они там говорят, стратегического поражения.
All this is doomed to fail, but London is totally complicit.
Замаран полностью.
We repeatedly warned that responses to Ukrainian strikes using British weapons on Russian territory could target any UK military facility or hardware in Ukraine and beyond. Those guilty of war crimes, including against our civilians, will be punished accordingly.
Сообразно содеянному.
Punishment is inevitable, and we urge all UK residents to ponder the catastrophic consequences of their own authorities' hostile moves.
Катастрофических последствиях враждебных шагов собственных властей.
We urge the British leadership to carefully review the situation once more, immediately, decisively, and unequivocally to abandon their hostile, aggressive course, which can only prolong the agony of the Kyiv Nazi regime and risk taking the conflict to an entirely new level.
Перевода конфликта на принципиально новый уровень.
And look at how these Ukrainian terrorists and militants are trained abroad. Reports have appeared in the German press about numerous cases of Ukrainian servicemen fleeing training grounds across Germany. We've spoken about these training grounds for a long time, not just since 2022, but back in 2014 and earlier, about how all the Maidans were rehearsed at similar sites in the Baltic states and Poland. Now we see them being drilled in Germany for years.
Они располагались в странах Прибалтики, в Польше, и вот теперь мы видим, как их уже натаскивают в Германии много лет.
And that is right in the heart of what they call the democratic European paradise. And Ukrainians are deserting there. Excuse me, but how can the European Commission and the European Union explain all this?
Может объяснить.
Let me just remind you what Kyiv propaganda was claiming. Kyiv propaganda kept telling Europeans they must give the Kyiv regime even more money because, according to Zelensky and his gang, Ukraine would supposedly defend Western Europeans from Russia, as they allegedly have the strongest army and just need lots of cash.
Защищать европейцев западных якобы от России, потому что они якобы самая сильная армия, просто им нужно много денег.
And now these very defenders of the blooming garden, defenders from supposedly barbaric, cruel Russia, are fleeing, simply deserting from training grounds in Germany.
Просто дезертируют с тренировочных полигонов в Германии.
No, this isn't combat. It isn't even an emergency. It's just training.
Даже какое-то просто чрезвычайное происшествие. Это просто тренировка.
They are running away from training. Who is going to defend Germany, as they imagined, or Poland, the Baltics, maybe France and Italy, from anyone?
Ну, там, наверное, Францию с Италией. От кого-нибудь.
Who among the purported defenders in the AFU ranks, I mean Ukrainian security services, if they flee even from training?
Я имею в виду украинских соответствующих силовых служб, если они даже с тренировок бегут.
I'd like to highlight a few very interesting points here. First, one should note the courage of Diet Site, which found the strength to look beyond the myth.
Которое нашло в себе силы выйти за рамки мифа
of Ukrainian soldiers' rights and report the ugly reality of AFU recruitment. Second, it's an obvious fact. Fleeing Ukrainian recruits clearly show they don't want to fight for the Kyiv regime's Nazi ideology, Zelensky's corrupt rule, or so-called European values. It's also clear that the AFU forced them to gain combat experience in Germany simply to use them as cannon fodder on the front line.
Опыт в ФРГ, чтобы затем использовать буквально как пушечное мясо на линии фронта.
You know, this is an incredible irony, not of history, but of those who, or maybe of history, but for those who don't know it.
А может быть истории, но для тех, кто эту историю не знает.
85 years ago, Ukrainians fled concentration camps in Germany and Western Europe.
Украинцы бежали из концлагерей.
The very torture chambers where they were thrown for fighting Nazism.
За то, что они сражались с нацизмом.
They fled, staged uprisings, joined rebellions, escaped, and perished. When caught, their escapes were thwarted. They were punished and shot, though some survived.
Кому-то удавалось выжить.
Now, 85 years have passed since the victory over Nazism. Well, I mean, 80 years have passed. And what now? Now, Ukrainians sent to Central Europe ostensibly voluntarily to gain Western European experience to use on the battlefield under Nazi banners against their recent compatriots, descendants of those who fought Nazism alongside their ancestors. These Ukrainians in Central Europe are fleeing training camps just as they fled concentration camps.
Против своих же собственных, еще недавно соотечественников и тех самых потомков, их же, потомков тех, кто вместе с их предками сражались против нацизма. И эти украинцы, оказывающиеся в центре Европы, бегут из этих самых тренировочных лагерей. Точно так же, как они бежали из концлагерей.
This is a striking irony. History for those who don't know it. Another crucial aspect. These escapes are not isolated incidents. It's not about a single person snapping or somehow showing some personal traits and so forth. They represent a trend. Everyone understands everything in Ukraine. That's why they flee when they can. According to Die Zeit, in Saxony-Anhalt alone, over 80 Ukrainian soldiers have fled training camps since 2022, not where Ukrainians were tortured, but where they were trained, with several hundred cases recorded across Germany. Facing up to 12 years in prison back home, they still risk hiding in EU countries.
Зафиксировано несколько сотен таких случаев. На родине беглецам грозит до 12 лет лишения свободы, однако они предпочитают рискнуть и укрыться в странах Европейского Союза.
According to DPA reports, the Bundeswehr leadership has already confirmed systematic desertion of Ukrainian soldiers from German training grounds, while refusing to help search for them, calling it, believe it or not, an internal matter of the AFU.
Внутренним делом ВСУ.
Great. The situation itself requires no special commentary. It's all quite clear. Returning deserters to the legal fold and determining their legal status is actually Germany's internal affair. Under these conditions, it's more logical for journalists to ask the German authorities whether the deserters can count on anything in light of recent statements by European Commission spokesman Lammert. Let me remind you, he stated, that every Ukrainian asylum seeker, I mentioned this today, both men and women, must prove they are not evading mobilization. The answer seems obvious to everyone anyway. This meat grinder of a conflict sponsored by the West. And it's truly fantastic how this Western-sponsored national ideology of the Kyiv regime manifests itself even in the scientific sphere.
Неонацистская идеология киевского режима, которая спонсируется Западом, проявляется в том числе в научной сфере.
Ukrainian authorities continue attempting to illegally seize the research findings of Russian archaeologists in Crimea.
Ученых-археологов на Крымском полуострове.
They intended to do so during the August 24th to 29th event in Vienna.
Проходит с 24 по 29 августа в Вене.
The forum was initially supposed to feature academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, professor, chairman of the National Committee of Byzantine Scholars, Sergei Pavlovich Karpov, who, for certain reasons, refrained from traveling to Vienna.
Воздержался от поездки в Вену.
I'd like to point out that on August 12th, just days before the Congress, a Kyiv court ordered the seizure of Russian delegates' research materials and sent a request to the Austrian Interior Ministry, which apparently was ready to comply. This recalls the recent detention in Poland of Russian archaeologist Alexander Butyagin at Ukraine's request. All this points to a targeted now to the situation in neighboring Moldova.
Надо быть предельно внимательными при выборе международных мероприятий. Ну и ситуация в соседней Молдавии.
On August 24th, they celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Republic's liberation from Romanian fascist occupiers. Ahead of and on that date, patriotic forces organized commemorative events, a march of freedom and peace with wreath-laying at the Eternity Memorial in Chisinau, conferences, memorial actions, and literary evenings with documentary screenings and memoirs of participants.
Показами документальной кинохроники и воспоминаний участников.
In those victorious events of August 1944. The Chisinau regime once again showed its true Nazi colors by not only ignoring this milestone date, but refusing to light the eternal flame at the Serpeni bridgehead, where 80 years ago fierce battles decided the outcome of the brilliant Iasi-Chisinau offensive.
Прошли ожесточенные бои, предопределившие исход блистательно проведенной Яско-Кишиневской наступательной операции.
Much was said. We will add links to today's briefing text. In Moldova itself, this move was called petty, vile, many things. Nevertheless, dedicated Moldovans for whom this date symbolizes courage, national unity,
национального единства,
and their dignity, independently lit candles to honor the hero liberators of their homeland. Yet, on the eve, August 24th, Moldovan authorities lit up the parliament building and the triumphal arch in central Chisinau in the Ukrainian flag's colors for Ukraine's Independence Day. Yes, you heard right. Ukraine's, not Moldova's. Chisinau found money for Ukraine and its independence, of which nothing remains thanks to the West, while Sandu lacked not the money for an eternal flame honoring their ancestors. They have it. She lacked even the desire, any hint of honoring those who made modern Moldova possible. By the way, on Ukraine's Independence Day, Chisinau opened an exhibition inside Parliament dedicated to churches and cultural heritage sites, allegedly damaged or destroyed by Russia. This shows what matters more to current Moldovan authorities, honoring fallen anti-fascist soldiers who gave their lives for victory, or serving the geopolitical interests of a narrow group of degenerates. The answer is obvious. In today's briefing text, we will link the Russian Foreign Ministry's third report on the outrages committed in Ukraine against the Russian Orthodox Church, its parishes and clergy.
Которое творится на Украине в отношении Русской Православной Церкви, приходов и, конечно, паствы.
Moving on. Official Chisinau keeps getting dragged deeper into initiatives catering to Zelensky's criminal regime and its foreign handlers. Sacrificing the interests of their own people, Moldovans. How else to explain Chisinau's decision to grant Ukraine a 50% discount on grain transit toward Romania from August 10th until year's end?
Скидки в 50% на перевозку зерновых культур в направлении Румынии.
Apparently, for these deals, Sandu and Zelensky recently exchanged state awards, including the Order of Princess Olga. A similar situation is unfolding regarding numerous concessions of Moldovan sovereignty to Romania. Amid an economic crisis in the Republic, the Chisinau regime is practically handing over the country's entire economic sector to Bucharest's control. We recall how in December 2023, the head of Moldova's National Bank and Romanian advisors were appointed to other ministries and agencies.
Даниэл Мариус Стайку, а также ряд румынских советников были назначены в другие министерства и ведомства.
On August 25th, media reported that former Romanian economy minister Claudiu Năsui was appointed Moldova's Minister of Economic Development and Digitalization, with Sandu signing his Moldovan citizenship decree. You won't believe it, the very same day, just for show. Thus, the Republic's pro-Western forces admit their incompetence and lack of domestic candidates, simply surrendering Moldova to a foreign state.
Достойных кандидатов на этот пост внутри своей страны и просто отдают Молдавию не уже на откуп, а просто чужому другому государству.
Just like that. Moldovan citizens firmly reject such anti-popular leadership initiatives that erode national independence and destroy their national identity. Moldovans deeply revere the defenders of their fatherland, who secured freedom for future generations, and they refuse to make any concessions.